afternoon. Welcome to the 60-minute briefing with Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We're very glad to have you here at this quite eventful time. I would say even sad time. I think we have to keep recalling that the United Kingdom has left the European Union. In many ways, it doesn't feel like it yet, given that we're still in the transition period. But as of the beginning of this month, the UK is a third country. And of course, that has many implications. We are now entering into the second phase of the negotiations. There are a number of difficult issues coming up, including the future relationship, including tricky questions like fisheries, like level playing field conditions, and maybe quite a concern that in the second phase we might not come to a satisfactory conclusion for both sides, that we are still facing a situation where by the end of this year, unless transition is extended, we might be in a position of no deal again. So it is a difficult time, and of course all of that has also implications for Scotland. So we're very glad you're here to give us your thoughts on how the UK-EU relationship might evolve, and how that will affect Scotland in particular, and what your vision is for the Scottish-EU relationship. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Fabian, and thank you to all of you for coming along here today. It's always a pleasure for me to be here in Brussels once the microphone is switched on. There we go. It's always a real pleasure to be here in Brussels, but as Fabian has alluded to, at this time it feels a little bit different. This is the first time I've been here. In fact, it's the first time I've been anywhere outside of Scotland since the UK left the European Union 10 days ago. And Brexit was certainly and is certainly a very sad matter for me and for many people in Scotland. And indeed, I think it's a sad occasion and event for many people across the UK. In fact, some of the most affecting moments of the week leading up to Brexit actually occurred here in Brussels. I was especially struck when I saw footage from the Wednesday of that week at the last session of the European Parliament to be attended by MEPs from the UK. The sincerity, the grace and the goodwill in speeches from people such as Guy Verhofstadt and Ursula von der Leyen was in itself impressive. But for many people, and perhaps in particular for many people in Scotland, the most moving moment of all was at the very end when MEPs from all parties and all countries stood together to sing Auld Lang Syne. And that scene, which was one of solidarity and friendship, encapsulated many of the values that the Scottish Government and many people in Scotland most cherish about the European Union. And for me, and I suspect for a lot of people in Scotland, hearing the words of Robert Burns in that room at that time had another effect. It reinforced the sense that Scotland has left a place where we feel we belong, that we should still be participating in that chamber rather than departing it. And on the same day that those scenes were taking place in the European Parliament, in fact almost exactly at the same time, the Scottish Parliament was doing something equally significant. It was voting to back a further referendum on Scottish independence. And I suppose the connections between these two scenes form the basis of the remarks I want to make to you today. I'm going to set out briefly the ongoing regret the Scottish Government feels over Brexit. I will then explain some of the ways in which the Scottish Government will seek to respond to Brexit. And of course, in doing that, I will make clear our desire to return to the European Parliament as an independent nation, comfortable as EU members, of course, have to be with the idea that independence in the modern world involves recognising and embracing our interdependence. As of course is now very well known, the majority of people in Scotland chose to stay in the EU when the question was asked in the referendum in 2016. Subsequent opinion polls suggest that pro-EU sentiment has grown since then, and our desire to stay has also been reaffirmed by 3 subsequent nationwide elections. In the UK general election in December, for example, parties in favour of remaining in the EU or in favour of holding a further EU referendum gained almost 3/4 of the vote. So the pro-European sentiment has very deep and very strong roots in Scotland. And of course, the basic principle behind the EU of independent nations working together for the common good is one which appeals to many people in Scotland. We also recognise and have seen this demonstrated very clearly in the last couple of years, the solidarity that the EU offers to smaller member states. People in Scotland have seen, and I suspect will long remember, the support that the EU gave to Ireland throughout the first stage of the Brexit process. In addition, we have day-to-day experience of the practical benefits of membership. EU regulations have made our rivers and coasts cleaner, our universities collaborate with research partners across the continent. EU freedom of movement has given opportunities to people living in Scotland and of course has encouraged new Scots to contribute to our economy and our society. And of course one of our priorities at present is to support these EU citizens to stay in Scotland and to feel welcome in Scotland, to feel, as we do, that it is their home. Of course, our businesses also benefit from the single market. And in fact, figures just last week demonstrated that over the past 5 years, Scotland's sales to the EU, which account for more than half of our international exports, have grown by more than 4% a year. That's more than twice as fast as our exports to the rest of the world. So we are leaving the European Union, imperfect though it undoubtedly is, at a time when we have never benefited from it more. And we're also leaving it, in my view, at a time when we have never needed it more. In an age when intolerance and bigotry seem to be on the rise, I think it's important that we hold true to the values of the EU, values of democracy, equality, solidarity, the rule of law, respect for human rights. These values are more important than they have ever been before. The founding motivation of the EU as a peace project is one which is perhaps too easily forgotten, certainly in the UK, but its importance has certainly struck me regularly in recent years at memorial events for the 2 world wars, and most recently, just a matter of days ago, for the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And at a time of climate crisis, cooperating with the EU improves our collective ability to tackle climate change at home and also amplifies our voice in international negotiations. And in an age of great trading blocs, the EU represents, in my view, our best opportunity in a very difficult climate for this, for benefiting from free trade without engaging in a race to the bottom. All of this, I think, is important. It helps to explain why Scotland regrets Brexit and why so many of us continue to feel European. But of course, the real question, and I'm sure the one you want me to focus on, isn't what we have lost since Brexit has now happened. It is what happens next. What practical steps can Scotland take to mitigate or reverse the consequences of the UK government's actions in bringing about Brexit? And there are essentially 2 parts to that answer. Firstly, for as long as Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom, the Scottish Government, will try to influence UK Government policy and, where possible, to work constructively with the UK Government. And that point, of course, extends far beyond the Brexit negotiations. As many of you will know, the COP26 Climate Summit will take place in Glasgow in November. That's due to be the most important climate summit since the Paris talks in 2015. In fact, given the ever-increasing urgency of the climate crisis, I think there's an argument for saying that it is more important than the Paris talks. There has been a lot of talk back in the UK recently about the Glasgow Summit and about relations between the Scottish and UK governments in regard to that. So it's maybe worth being very clear about my approach here. There is a strong argument, I think a very strong argument, for saying that nothing that happens anywhere in the world this year will be more important than making that Glasgow Summit a success. The Scottish Government therefore will work as hard as we can to make it a success. That includes working positively and constructively with the UK Government. And a similar principle applies to the UK's negotiations with the EU. We will do what we can to work as closely and constructively as possible. In doing so, despite our pessimism about the direction of travel of the UK Government in terms of its future relationship with the EU, we will work to try to influence negotiations in a way which benefits Scotland, which benefit the UK and the EU. In particular, we will continue to stress the value of having a close trading relationship with the EU, as close a relationship as possible. The Prime Minister, of course, made a speech about this last week. He insisted in that speech on having the right to diverge from EU standards in areas like social and environmental standards. On the other hand, the EU basically wants a guarantee that the UK will not regress, that the UK will not undercut the EU by adopting lower standards. This, of course, is an issue that matters hugely. As the EU continually makes clear, the more we diverge from EU standards, the less access we'll have to the single market. So the right to diverge will come at a cost, a very heavy cost, in fact, in my view, a cost that is too heavy. In the areas where non-regression applies, the UK has and will always have the ability to opt for higher standards than those required by the EU. Although the Prime Minister never explicitly said this, in fact, he never gave a single concrete example of an area in which divergence could benefit the UK. The only possible reason for wanting the freedom to diverge is if you want to adopt lower standards than the EU does. So as things stand, there is a danger, or there is certainly reason for a real concern that the UK will in future significantly reduce our access to the single market, something which will harm manufacturers and service industries across the country because it wants the freedom to lower standards relating to health, safety, the environment and workers' rights. The Scottish Government will argue very strongly against that approach. We largely support the idea of a level playing field, which removes the possibility of the UK adopting lower standards than the EU. That helps to protect our environmental standards and working conditions, and it also makes it easier for Scottish businesses to export to the EU. We will continually make the case for that as these negotiations proceed. That said, on past evidence, I have to confess that I'm not overly optimistic about our chances of being successful. So we're also looking in Scotland to what we can do within our devolved powers to maintain the closest possible ties with Europe. We, for example, intend to introduce legislation which enables Scotland to keep pace with EU regulatory standards where we have the power to do so. It is a way in which we can protect the health and well-being of people in Scotland, maintain the international reputation of businesses in Scotland, and make it easier when the time comes, as I believe it will, for Scotland to return to the European Union. And we will also, and this is the second part of our approach, work towards the most obvious and important steps Scotland can take in response to Brexit. We will seek to become an independent country and then seek to re-establish our EU membership. And the case for us being able to choose independence is clear. 6 years ago, as all of you know, Scotland had a vote on whether to become an independent country. Opponents of independence said repeatedly that voting to remain in the UK was the only way for us to stay in the European Union. I think it's fair to say it hasn't quite worked out that way. But there is a serious point, because that argument weighed heavily with many voters back in 2014. Since then, of course, we've been taken out of the EU against our will. Our efforts at compromise of keeping the UK inside the single market and the customs union have been rejected, and the overall approach taken to Brexit has consistently been contrary to Scotland's views, to our values and to our interests. And strong support for the EU is, I think, one of the main reasons that the party I lead, the SNP, did so well in the recent UK general election, in which we won 80% of all of the seats in Scotland and recorded a higher vote share in Scotland than Boris Johnson did across the UK. We put front and centre in that election the right of the people of Scotland to choose their own future, to choose between staying in the UK after Brexit or becoming an independent country. Since that election, opinion polls in Scotland have shown majority support for independence, and there are very large majorities for the principle that it should be for the Scottish Parliament, not Westminster governments, to determine whether and when there should be an independence vote. I'm a believer in democracy, in the rule of law, in the power of respectful persuasion and deliberation, even although my faith in that may have been tested somewhat over the past 3 years. But it is why I continue to believe that as we press the case for Scotland's right to choose, we should agree a process between ourselves and the UK government for a referendum in line with the clear mandate given by the people of Scotland. Now, none of this, I think, should be a matter of great controversy with the UK government. The UK is not a unitary state, it's a voluntary union of nations. And one of those nations, Scotland, has expressed majority support time and again for remaining in the EU. I don't believe it is right that more than 5 million EU citizens should be removed from the European Union after 47 years of membership without even the chance to have their say on the future of their country. That's why we are taking in Scotland and the Scottish Government the steps required to ensure that a referendum can be held that is legal and legitimate, so that the result can be accepted and embraced both at home and internationally. We're asking the Electoral Commission, the independent body that oversees elections and referendums in the UK, to test again the question that would be asked in that referendum, and inviting Scotland's elected representatives to gather in a new constitutional convention to broaden and embed that support for self-determination for Scotland's right to choose. In the weeks ahead, we'll also continue to update the independence proposition to give people the information they need to make an informed choice about Scotland's future. The series of papers that we'll publish to do that will include our plans for EU membership. I know, and indeed some of the comments made by Donald Tusk last week confirmed this, that there is goodwill towards Scotland in Europe. We want to build on that goodwill. We are keen to outline a clear route to re-accession, to show that we understand what EU membership requires, and to demonstrate that we have much to offer, as I believe we do. Some of that, of course, should be relatively straightforward. We already comply with the EU acquis, and as I've said, we're passing legislation to ensure that that continues to be the case where practically possible. We also welcome free movement because we support it in principle, but know how much Scotland has to benefit from that. And I hope that our overall approach as a constructive friend and partner to the EU is not in doubt. Of course, Brexit has changed the context of the choice that will be offered to the people of Scotland compared with 2014. But fundamentally, there is a choice, and there should be a choice. Do we in Scotland believe that it is better for our future or not to be part of the world's largest trading bloc and the shared values and benefits of EU membership? Ultimately, when, and I do believe that it is a when, Scotland gains independence, I believe that the case for us joining the EU will be an overwhelming one. And that view, I know, is shared by many distinguished experts, although many of them will not take a view on whether or not Scotland should be independent. But I was struck by a paper that Fabian wrote about Scotland and the EU last summer, which put, I think, the basic issue really well. It said that for Europe, rejecting a country that wants to be in the EU, accepts all conditions, is willing to go through the appropriate processes and follows European principles should be inconceivable. Apart from anything else, we will rejoin not simply as a country with much to gain, but as one which has much to contribute. That is made clear by the strategy document we published a couple of weeks ago, setting out Scotland's perspective on the key policy priorities for the EU set out by Ursula von der Leyen, the new president. Her support for an economy that works for everyone finds direct echoes in Scotland, a country that is increasingly focusing on well-being alongside wealth as a measurement of success. Her emphasis on Europe fit for the digital age is also one we strongly support. Scotland is already becoming one of the most important tech centres anywhere in Europe. Her desire for a Green New Deal is one we also share. Scotland has some of the strongest statutory climate change targets in the world. We want to help lead the world into the net zero age, and we know that our efforts would be enhanced by membership of the EU. The Commission's other priorities also speak to our shared values. In all of these areas, Scotland is a country which can and will make a difference. We can lead by example where that's possible, but also learn from the example of others. But we know that we will do this more effectively by working in partnership. We believe, and I believe very strongly, that our sovereignty will be amplified, not diminished, by membership of the EU. I began a few moments ago by reflecting on the last appearance for now of Scottish MEPs in the European Parliament. And when the old Scottish Parliament had its last sitting some time ago, back in 1707, proceedings were closed then by the Speaker, Lord Seafield, and he said that it was the end of an old sang. These remarks, I thought, found a curious echo in the scenes at the European Parliament 2 weeks ago. The singing of Auld Lang Syne marked the end of something which, although maybe not that old, has been very important to many people in Scotland. But our task now is to try and turn that end into a beginning, to find our voice as an independent nation and take our place on the European and the world stage. And when we do that, we'll have the opportunity to speak up together with friends across Europe and around the world for democracy, equality and human rights. We have the ability to contribute hugely to tackling the challenges such as the climate crisis that the world faces, and we'll be able to work in partnership to enhance the well-being of people in Scotland, Europe and around the world. So for all of these reasons, and no doubt many more, I look forward to the day when Scotland returns where I think we belong, to EU membership with a place in our own right in the Council and the European Parliament. As an independent nation, we will embrace international cooperation, and then we can sing of solidarity and friendship, not out of sorrow, but with optimism and hope for the future. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share these thoughts with you today, and I look forward now to your questions and our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, First Minister. I'll start with a question and then I'll open it up to the audience. You were talking at the end about what it would be like if Scotland comes back into the European Union. I want to ask you what kind of member state, what kind of EU member would Scotland be? And what I'm thinking here is obviously it is not the UK membership. The UK membership has come with a lot of special provisions, opt-outs, the rebate. The UK is a very different country, a large country rather than a small country. So how would you see Scotland positioning itself within the EU?
Well, I think... Sorry, the microphone. Well, I believe Scotland would be a constructive and enthusiastic EU member state. We are a small country, but I believe small countries can have a big influence if they work smartly and cleverly. There are areas of current EU provision that we would, as a country, argue for change and reform, and that is in the nature of these things, the Common Fisheries Policy being one example of that. But I wouldn't see Scotland as a semi-detached, reluctant member of the EU, but one instead that seeks to use our expertise and the shared priorities we have to play a positive part in creating the kind of Europe that we want to be part of. So I think Europe, like Scotland, has a lot to gain from that situation, and that's why I hope it's not too much further into the future before it happens.
Thank you. So I'll take 3 or 4 questions at the same time, and I'll start right at the back. I've seen 2 more, and I'll come back to the rest afterwards.
Thank you. James Chris from the Daily Telegraph. I'm at the back here. You mentioned the Common Fisheries Policy, First Minister, and you said, you'd argue for reform. But you can only really argue for reform of the Common Fisheries Policy once you're a member. You can't argue for reform of it during an accession process. So how would you make the argument to Scottish fishermen that they would have to rejoin a policy which is widely believed to be skewed against them?
I'm Fraser Cameron. I actually helped set up the European movement in Scotland some 50 years ago, so I must say I agree with everything you said. But we've got to get from A to B, and there's 2 stages. I mean, one, assuming the SNP win a clear majority at the next parliamentary elections, is that sufficient, do you think, to persuade the British government to actually pass the legislation for a second referendum? And of course, the second part is, now that Scotland's out, there's 2 questions that come back possibly to haunt you. One, the old one, is the currency issue that played a part in the 2014 referendum. But now you've got the border issue potentially between Scotland and England. So any thoughts on these issues would be interesting.
Thank you. Michael Peel, Financial Times. I also have a question about fish. The Scottish salmon producers were warning today of the extra burdens created by Brexit. Clearly there's a lot of concern. How concerned are you about the way that UK
fisheries policy seems to be going after Brexit, and how much of a problem do you think that will be for Scottish producers?
Well, thank you for all these questions. Let me take James and Michael's first and together, since they are broadly speaking on the same issue. And actually, the answer lies, in a sense, in the different angles that those 2 questions came from on the same issue. In terms of my message to Scottish fishermen, my party is a long-standing critic of the Common Fisheries Policy, but I think Scottish fishermen were made promises in the run-up to and since the Brexit referendum that we are about to see are very difficult for the UK government to deliver. Effectively, the promise that was made was that we could have control over Scottish waters at the same time as having no compromise of our ability to trade and sell our fish into European markets. And I think the reality of that is about to be seen. And, we see from the salmon producers this morning the real concerns about the impact of having tariffs or greater bureaucracy in terms of selling the produce into the European market. So what we have to do is get a sensible position that, yes, I think it seeks to improve the position of Scotland within that framework in terms of control over our own waters, but recognises that, if landing more fish, if you cannot process the fish because you've got restrictions on European labour working in our fish processing plants, or if you then can't sell that fish into the markets that we currently sell them into, is not the ideal situation to have. Now, the promises that were made by the Tories, I think the Tories deserve to be held to account and have their feet held to the fire on the delivery of these promises. But my job is to have, I guess, more honest conversations with not just our fishing communities, but with all interests in Scotland about the benefits of EU membership, the ability it gives you to try to argue for change from the top table, but the ability to keep the place in the world's biggest trading market, which I think we lose at our peril. Fraser, in terms of your questions, on the referendum point, I've made very clear, I'll make clear again today, I'm interested in having a legal referendum that has a sound legal basis that is legitimate, so that the outcome of it is accepted domestically and at a European and international level. In my view, there's not much point in having a referendum process that can deliver effective independence. I think people look at the impasse between the Scottish Government and the UK Government just now and think, oh, that will never be broken. I do not believe that is the case. And I don't believe Boris Johnson and the UK Government thinks that either. If we continue to see support for independence rise, as we have been doing, if we continue to see demand for that choice continue to grow, then ultimately you cannot stand in the way of that clear democratic choice. And the reason I believe that Boris Johnson knows that is because if you look closely at his utterances and behaviour around this, he is somebody that realises that he has to make an argument for the union and against independence. And there's talk of the UK government spending large amounts of taxpayers' money on adverts in Scotland to extol the virtues of the union. Why would you do that if you think you can stop people in Scotland forever having the choice? So democracy will prevail. My job is to continue to increase support for independence so that it becomes an unanswerable case for that choice to be made. On the issues, we will, as I said in my remarks, we'll set out very detailed propositions updating the case that we made in 2014 on all of those issues. On currency, we argued for a currency union in 2014. As it happens, I think that would have happened if Scotland had voted for independence then. My party has looked at that position again. We will use sterling until such times as it's right to move to a Scottish currency, and obviously that will be an issue that we take full account of in any discussions with the European Union. And on the point about borders, it's not independence that threatens borders, it's Brexit that does that. It's the approach to Brexit that has been taken. One of the reasons why I'll continue to argue for the relationship to be as close as possible. But obviously when we see where the UK-EU relationship ends up, then I can work out, the Scottish Government can work out how we mitigate that in a Scottish sense, and we'll be frank and open with people as we proceed through those discussions.
Thanks. I'm very tempted to ban questions on fish, but not sure I can enforce it. So I've seen those two, and then...
Thank you. John Clark from the European Commission. My question is not about fish. First Minister, you've spoken about the people of Scotland having the right to choose their own future, and the UK is a voluntary union of nations. Now, a lot of distinguished lawyers and political commentators have made the case that Scotland, under international law, does not need the permission of the UK government either for a referendum or to declare independence. You can go ahead without the permission of Westminster. But indeed, the UK government has made the very same argument at the International Court of Justice in the case of Kosovo, arguing that Kosovo did not need the permission of the state it belonged to. So why do you feel the need to have a referendum? Why don't you simply declare independence as is permitted under international law?
Do you want me to do it now or later? Just so I'm clear.
Sorry, I'm from the Parliament magazine. If you fail to get what you want, your second referendum, if you fail to get the second referendum, what is the plan B? What do you do then? Can you say, if there is a plan B, and if so, what exactly is it, please?
Yeah, my name is Matthijs Schiffers from Het Financiële Dagblad, the Dutch Financial Times. I would like to hear your thoughts about a bridge between Northern Ireland and Scotland. Northern Ireland has some kind of special situation now after Brexit. Would that give you some arguments to ask for the same if you're connected to this part of the world?
Okay. John, I'll take your question in two parts quickly. Why bother with a referendum and not simply declare independence? Is because I am a Democrat. I think in order to legitimately become independent, we have to demonstrate in Scotland that it is the will of a majority of people in Scotland. Now, we have opinion polls suggesting that independence now has majority support, but I think that has to be demonstrated by people voting positively for that. I don't believe we can short-circuit the need to demonstrate that it is the will of the majority, and therefore that's why I say we have to have a process that demonstrates rather than, however tempting it may be for me simply to declare it, I suspect I may have difficulty in getting others to recognise that. The second part of the question is, why don't we have a referendum without the agreement of the UK government? And I should say the ability or otherwise of the Scottish Parliament and government to do that has never been tested in court. We have the legislation that set up the Scottish Parliament has as what's called a reserved competence of Westminster, the Constitution. But whether that gives the Scottish Parliament or government any powers to hold a referendum without the agreement of the UK government hasn't been tested. I'm not ruling out, and I've never ruled out that at some point, if this impasse continues, it may have to be tested. But, you know, putting things in the hands of the courts is always uncertain in terms of the outcome. And actually, I think what we should be doing is seeking agreement to allowing the people of Scotland to have that choice. And I think the way to break that impasse is actually to make the support for and case for independence so strong that no Prime Minister, even Boris Johnson, can stand in the way of that. And, you know, in answer to the second question, that's my plan A, B and C. I think ultimately this is a democratic issue that should be resolved democratically and politically. And, you know, if we see support for Scottish independence continuing to be strong and become stronger, then whatever his bluff and bluster may suggest at the moment, then Boris Johnson or any other Prime Minister is not going to be able to stand in the way of that. And then on to his bridge from Scotland to Northern Ireland. I should say Boris Johnson, I think, has promised lots of physical bridges in his political career so far. He hasn't delivered, to the best of my knowledge, a single one of them. Look, I bow to nobody in my ambitions for Scotland and in my ambitions for Scotland to be, you know, connected to Ireland and to Europe. But I do think there are big practical questions over the feasibility and deliverability of this, not just the distance, but the depth of the water. There's an old munitions dump underneath it. You know, we'll see where it goes. I certainly don't close my eyes or close my mind to suggestions like this, but I suspect from Boris Johnson it's more a diversionary tactic to have people talking about that rather than some of the real issues we're grappling with in both Scotland and Ireland. So I would say if he's got £20 billion or whatever it might take to build such a bridge, go and spare it just now. I'm sure both the Scottish Government and the Northern Ireland Executive could find lots of ways to spend it on possibly more important priorities.
Hi, Dave Clark from Agence France Presse. My question's about the negotiations for the future free trade agreement, specifically about fish. As far as we understand it, the negotiating mandate that Monsieur Barnier is going to take to London includes the demand that we uphold the current quota system. As you've just said, that would break Boris Johnson's promise to Scottish fishermen. Which way should he go? Should he unblock the talks by giving way on fish, or should he stick by his promise to become an independent coastal state?
Thanks. First Minister Roddy Thompson, freelance. Couple of questions. If I could ask specifically about reports that the European Commission has reacted, obviously, to the projection of the Europe-Scotland love stunt in the days after Brexit. And secondly, you touched on this, I think, in your last answer, but Joanna Cherry seems to have pushed the point that the possibility to test the legal argument behind a referendum that might be driven by the Scottish Parliament, do you recognise that that may have a stronger case while Scotland is still subject to ECJ arbitration during transition?
No, I don't think that last point is particularly relevant on that point. On the issue of a legal challenge, I kind of set out my own views on this 10 days ago. I don't think we should rule that out, but if you're asking me where I think we should expend our energy on a legal process with an uncertain outcome or in building the political case for independence and for an independence referendum, I choose the latter. That is my judgment. And that judgment, that balance of judgment may change as time goes on, but that is my judgment at the moment. On the question, you know, the independent coastal state promise was one that was made and made very expressly and very strongly. And, you know, I think Boris Johnson has to find a way of delivering on the promise to the fishing community around the the independence and control and access points while also securing access to markets. I don't pretend that that is an easy circle for him to square, but it was his party that made the promises, and you know, I think there'll be lots of people in Scotland looking to see how he delivers on that. So it's not an either or. The promise was both, and you know, it's over to him. That was on that point. Oh, sorry, the projection. I've only just seen comments from the Commission as I came in, but the only comment I've had here today, as I've been sort of going around my meetings this morning, has been entirely positive about what seems to have been interpreted as a really positive show of love and solidarity from Scotland to Europe. So I've not met anybody here today who's been particularly upset or at all upset by it. I think one of the points the Commission appeared to make is that it's not the first time a message has been projected onto the Bellymont, and I'm sure it won't be the last. And whether it's the Commission building or the Houses of Commons and Big Ben in London or the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, it's quite a common and well-tried way of sending a message and making a point, and it was a very strong point of solidarity from Scotland to the European Union.
There were two in the back.
Yeah, well, thank you. Joe Barnes from the Daily Express. Just to go back to the point of the illumination, the Commission have actually phoned the police, or the Belgian police, and referred, because it's not legal in Belgium. So could you kind of refer to that? Have you been spoken to by the authorities in Belgium about the illumination?
No.
Okay.
They're outside.
That answer both questions back there. Okay, there's one there.
Thanks. Oh, you just need to speak, really. Okay. Nick Guthrie from The Sun. You mentioned earlier about setting out a roadmap for joining the EU and waiting for the result of the UK talks. But how long do you expect accession realistically to take to the EU? And would you look to negotiate a withdrawal agreement and transition with the UK while you did that? Or would you look to leave straight away if you got independence? And if I could very quickly ask a question on behalf of my Scottish colleagues, as we were talking about the police just now. Have you had any contact from the police about the conduct of your ex-finance minister? And do you think he should now quit the Scottish Parliament? Thank you.
In answer to that last question, no, I certainly haven't. And on the question of being an MSP or not, I absolutely understand the sentiment that is being expressed around that. I'm sure Derek Mackay will be reflecting carefully on that. It's not a decision for me. I cannot force somebody to resign as a member of the Scottish Parliament. There's obviously in the SNP a process underway following his suspension last week, and as is always the case in these situations, I don't want to say anything that interferes with that process. On the question of transition and timing of that, as was the case in 2014, following a vote for independence, of course there would be a period of transition. We set out the detail of that in 2014, and that will be part of the proposition that we update in the months to come. And you know, obviously the parallel process of Scotland re-establishing membership of the European Union, we will set out the detail of how we see those two positions and those two timescales overlapping.
We've got time for one last round of questions, if there are any pressing ones. I will add one, and then I'll take that one as well. Just in terms of how we move forward from here, one of the big issues we're facing is the time limitations. We have less than 11 months to not only negotiate but to ratify this agreement. There's a lot of agreement that the complexity of that is such that even if we only aim for a very minimal agreement, this could be extremely challenging. Do you think the Prime Minister might change his mind in terms of asking for an extension or not? But I'll take the other question as well, and then I'll give you a final round.
Juliana Dalpino. I'm representing a coalition called All Policies for a Healthy Europe. And my question is regarding, once ascending to the European Union, the ambitions and possibilities of making the European Union an economy of well-being.
Thank you. On the point around extension, I think we have to assume right now that what the UK government says about refusing to countenance a further extension is what they mean, because I think you have to take people at their word and at face value, and I think it would be dangerous given the tightness of time to assume that, you know, at the 11th hour, last minute, there's going to be a change of heart. That said, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility, and it certainly would be not contrary to past behaviour. If Boris Johnson did change his position, he would probably assert that his position was exactly the same as it had always been, even though it had changed in reality. So I wouldn't rule that out, but I don't think we should operate on the basis that that is going to ride to anybody's rescue. And on the last point, which is a really good question to end on, I am a great enthusiast for the notion of a well-being economy, of seeing well-being and happiness and the health of a population as important as the economic growth of a country. Scotland is part of an alliance with Iceland and New Zealand, which we're hoping to see other countries join in the not too distant future to, you know, build support for that. And I think there is, based on discussions I've had here and with various interests in the European Union, I think there is an open door and an appetite to see Europe embrace that, and it's something I would certainly very strongly encourage.
Thank you very much, First Ministers. I think we had a good discussion, maybe a bit too much fisheries, but and we didn't quite get the declaration of Scottish independence in the EPC, but certainly contrary to some of the comments I received on Twitter, there will be a Scottish-EU relationship. We don't know what that relationship is going to look like. There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, but certainly it helps us for you to come here and to explain how the Scottish government sees it and what you see in the coming years and the ambitions you have for Scotland to come back to the European Union as a member state. So thank you very much for coming today, and I'm sure we will welcome you again in future. Thank you.